We have graduation gaps. Our 6-year graduation gap for students, for white students is 68%, but Latinx graduate at the 61% rate and Afro-Americans at 51%. The gap is unknown as of the reporting in iPads that I consulted for this talk. And yet, these are gaps that we're working on actively and deliberately. I mean, just to be perfectly honest, I think Brett's data about the professorate, Afro-Americans entering the professorate, is also modeled, tends to be in our undergraduate enrollments. But I'd like to take a little second, though, to look at a little data that Kenny Morrell gathered for a panel that I had the pleasure of hosting at SCS this past conference that I think is kind of helpful. So the first slide, which you should now be able to see, tells a kind of a scary story, and that is that the number of liberal arts colleges and graduate institutions between 2006, 2007, this is done with a grant from the Teagle Foundation, was at so many institutions, and revisiting those same data points 11 years later demonstrated changes in enrollments and number of programs to the tune of bachelor's degrees in classics retracting by 20%, and nearly the same at graduate institutions. And yet holding steady generally at the number of faculty, at least at liberal arts colleges, while at graduate institutions, those numbers have declined precipitously. And yet there are parts of our instruction that are actually holding quite steady and possibly even growing. The next slide from Kenny again shows the number of the enrollments in courses that we typically teach in our classics programs. And while the number of courses and the enrollments in the primary languages is nosediving, our enrollments in non-language courses, that is our history, culture, and literature, has gone up really quite spectacularly. Which is to say, our discipline is relevant and still felt to be relevant. And although it's anecdotal, I can only speak for my own experience at Mary Washington. I can say my classes that are not language classes enroll a respectable and proportionate to our undergraduate student body number of people of color. It's not that we have to be irrelevant. it's maybe sometimes that and in fact there are things that we can do in the classroom, and I think Ian and Brett both have done a great job mapping out some of the salutary things that we can do there. And finally, I want to talk about just very briefly some of the changes in myself as a prelude to talking about some movements in higher education, and I'm aware of the time. When I first got out of grad school, I was junior faculty, like many of you. And I wonder, with the questions of the conflict and my willingness to engage it at a deeper level as a professional, if part of that came from the fact that I was junior faculty and that I was going to be trying to present and publish in places where that might not have helped me. And I know that that's selfish, but that's a practical concern that I think many junior scholars 2 decades ago felt. And I'm so encouraged that the work that's being done by this generation of classicists. I think it's, and a conference like ours and the organizations Hannah listed at the outset are a testament to how far we've come. But I also grew in the way I think about higher education, and with some leadership experiences at my own institution, and with a year that I spent as a fellow with the American Council on Education, where I had the opportunity to shadow executive leadership and to think broadly about higher education in the United States, as well as in Mexico and South Africa as an international phenomenon. And think, although this wasn't my primary purpose, also about where is classics in that figure. And so the next portion of my paper that I wanted to spend just a little bit amount of time on is something I found very helpful in trying to understand the role of higher education, or of education in general in a culture. And I need to acknowledge the work of Ira Harkavy in a book that is listed at the end of this presentation if you want to download my slides. But basically, and I have to do this very briefly with consideration of time, but, and I know this isn't comprehensive, but it's helpful to map out, this heuristic is helpful to me in analyzing the kind of institutions, the competing value within institutions, and even the competing values within ourselves that produce conflict about what we do as educators. And so, yes, this is the architectural plan of the Pantheon, and no, it's not found in our Freeman Butt's seminal work, A Cultural History of Education, but this is my memory palace. Welcome to my mind. If you enter the temple of the dozen purposes of education, you cannot get there but through knowledge. If there's one thing that we as an industry do, is we aggregate, disseminate, create, collect, analyze knowledge. If there's one thing we do better than anything else that we're designed to do, that is it. But that is not all we have ever done, and multiple things are, and so while we never discard knowledge as the central entry point for our industry, it's easy enough to forget that we do other things. We mold character. We help people with ethical thinking. We talk about critical thinking, as we have talked about today, that you need to take things more than just on received tradition, and you need to think for yourself and think about what's right, and that's often tied to character. We develop capacities, think writing intensive, speaking intensive. We develop the whole person, the cura personalis. Much of what we do is devoted to developing vocations. So a lot of the industry of higher ed is developed around that. Classics finds its place very often with cultural integration. You study this and you become part of the culture, and you become so much a piece of it. And I feel this myself, that you become a transmitter of that culture from generation to generation. In another time and place, and in certain contexts, education has even been seen as the soul's salvation. But when we go down the right wing, we see education is often married with citizenship, being aware of rights and responsibilities. We connect that outward to our social responsibilities to see that we are not citizens in isolation, but that we are part of bigger social wholes. And finally, when and where necessary, we need to be ready to act, to act for and bring about social change. So Butt spills this empirically out of a history of a large swath of world cultural education, and so this is not, this is derived from actual practice, not theory. But my point is to say that I think we feel pulled by a lot of different forces, whether it's administrators or our own graduate education, but we get pulled in a lot of different directions. So To conclude, um, I see, or to finish up a little bit on that topic, just to, in conclusion, I think it's fair to say that the dominant tendency of R1s and those of us who've been produced by them um, is to place knowledge writ large as for the first and last goal of education. And more often than we care to admit, we do so to the exclusion of much else, including social justice, although we don't even balk when it comes to vocations. We are designed for knowledge, but vocation looms large, as I said, and we're designed for knowledge, but we often ask too little of ourselves in using that knowledge to produce social change, even when we know it's necessary. So in conclusion, it's not that I didn't at that time have time to talk about social justice, but I had to overcome a narrowing of my professional outlook that prevented me from seeing everything that was there, and pausing to acknowledge my own questions and from engaging with the students' questions then and the questions that they're even more likely to have now. And while I don't have time to retranslate the poem with you, measuring every word and not rejecting my previous rhetorical analysis so much as enlarging it to uncover the rest of the story, we would pause even more on Cleopatra, the power and the powerlessness of women, the illusion of Antonius, the revolutionary upstart, Caesar Augustus, the Orientalist division of East and West, the history of oppression and subjugation, the cruelty of praising a so-called voluntary suicide rather than questioning the merciless powers, the civis liberis, that a Sime guest, Caesar's heir, had quite probably insisted upon.